Welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today I speak to Vikram Aditya, who is the principal scientist and faculty at the Center for Wildlife Studies. He leads the wildlife hunting and trade program at the Center for Wildlife Studies. He has worked extensively on the conservation of small and large mammals in the forests of Eastern Ghats. Today's episode mostly revolves around his work in this region and what can be improved in the Eastern Ghats for the conservation of biodiversity. Tune in to listen more and don't forget to subscribe and share to this episode. Welcome, Vikram. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast here.
Thank you very much, Anish. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak about wildlife on your podcast.
Most of your work has revolved around small mammals, particularly in the Eastern Ghats. What got you interested in studying small mammals?
So initially, I wanted to study small mammals and their diversity and distribution patterns in the Eastern Ghats. One of the reasons was that because most of the research in India, overwhelming part of the wildlife research in India goes into large mammals, as you know, particularly species like tiger, elephant, lions, leopards, maybe to some extent also wild dogs and snow leopards. These get most of the research attention in India, whereas very little of it goes into studying small mammals, which are much more numerous. There's a lot of other species of small mammals that are there, but very little research has been focused on them. And so I wanted to start off studying how small mammals are responding to land use change and landscape change. That was my initial interest. But then I later on thought that, why only study small mammals? Because all mammals are affected by habitat loss, habitat degradation, land use change. So for my PhD, I studied the entire mammal community that I could capture from using camera traps and science surveys. So these included the small mammals as well as large mammals, but not rodents and bats. And the Eastern Ghats, because I am from the Eastern Ghats region, I am from Hyderabad, and the Eastern Ghats is very close to us, and very few studies had been done there. So I really wanted to try and understand how landscape change was happening and how this was affecting the mammal community. Yeah, so this is what got me initially interested in studying small mammals.
Talk a bit about the biodiversity of the Eastern Ghats because it's not as spoken about as other landscapes such as the Western Ghats, the Western Himalayas, Madhya Pradesh.
Sure. So Eastern Ghats has a lot of species. So to talk about mammals, we have a lot of most of the other mammals, the large mammals that you see in India, you also see them in the Eastern Ghats as well. So you have tiger, you have leopard, you have sambar, gaur, elephant. You have other herbivores like nilgai, chital, four-horned antelope, blackbuck. So these are the large mammal community that you see there. Among the smaller mammals, we have a lot of medium and small mammals like civet, small Indian civet, palm civet, and a lot of other species are being discovered from the Eastern Ghats region recently. So from our study, we found evidence. We found camera trap photos of the striped-necked mongoose, which was only there in the Western Ghats before. I mean, it was only recorded from the Western Ghats, but we've seen it in the northern Eastern Ghats as well. It was supposed to be an endemic to the Western Ghats. So we've also seen wolf in the forest in the Eastern Ghats. There's also hyena, there's pangolins. So most of the larger fauna that you see across India, you also see them in the Eastern Ghats as well. The Eastern Ghats doesn't have as many endemic species as the Western Ghats or the Himalayas, but it still has a large and a considerable diversity of mammals, as well as birds and other invertebrates as well.
You are the principal scientist at the Center for Wildlife Studies. So could you just elaborate a bit on CWS's wildlife and trade program?
Right. So the Center for Wildlife Studies has started a wildlife hunting and trade program, initially starting off in the Eastern Ghats. And then later on, we want to also expand the program to the Western Ghats as well as other parts of India. Right now, our aim from the program is to try and understand the extent of hunting that's going on in the northern Eastern Ghats landscape and what species are being hunted. So we want to try and get at try and understand what species are being targeted for hunting and how many numbers of each of those species is being hunted. And through doing on-the-ground interviews with communities who are engaged in hunting, And then we also want to extrapolate this at a landscape level to try and get an idea of how many of these species are getting taken out from the forests, and then how many of them end up in trade also, because not all animals that are hunted are also traded. Many of them are consumed locally, whereas only a portion of them are traded. So our long-term vision is to it's two-pronged. One is to try and understand the scale of hunting and wildlife trade that's happening, what species are being affected. So we want to do this from using interviews with the local communities and doing field surveys, by setting up camera traps and doing other surveys in the forest to see how species are getting affected. So this is one part of it. The second part is we want to try and mitigate hunting as much as possible. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, but so we want to do community engagement workshops and also workshops with young kids and school going children as well as youth. We want to so in these workshops we want to talk to them about the threats that wildlife face, and also zoonosis and the public health risks of engaging in hunting and bushmeat consumption. Because as you know, after COVID, a lot of there was a lot of highlight on the role of wildlife trade in spreading zoonosis like COVID. So we want to use that momentum to sort of try and drive home this message that wildlife hunting can be dangerous from a public health point of view as well. That it can lead to the spread of novel infectious diseases from animals to humans. So this is a point that was not spoken about much before, and this is what we want to talk to them about. At the same time, we also want to do workshops with the government agencies, particularly the forest department, on trying to identify wildlife products and what kind of legal mechanisms are in place to mitigate wildlife trade, because a very strong awareness is not there among the line staff, at a field level. So these are all part of our long-term program, which we want to start initially in the Eastern Ghats and then expand to the Western Ghats as well.
Recently, you studied the impact of COVID on the pangolin trade. What were your findings?
So we wanted to, this was during COVID, during the first phase of COVID. And we were getting reports. We were all, of course, locked up in our own homes and we couldn't go anywhere. But from our contacts in the field, we were getting reports that there's a lot of hunting going on, and considerable amount of wildlife trade as well. So we wanted to try and understand the scale of this, and in particular during the lockdown. So we scanned through media reports and online reports of cases of seizures from hunting and wildlife trade. And what we found was that particularly we wanted to understand the case of pangolin, because pangolin is one species which is very heavily targeted for hunting. And a lot of it enters the wildlife trade market as well. So what we found is that during the first lockdown months between March and August of 2020, there was a spike by 3 times in the number of cases of hunting of pangolins relative to 2018 and 2019. So so we found 117 or 119 cases of wildlife trade in these 3 years during those months only, and it spiked by 3 times in 2020 related to 2019 and 2018. And not just pangolins, a lot of other species also were being hunted and traded during that time. The reason was because there were 2-3 reasons for this. One thing is that a lot of people lost their jobs, livelihoods, and they had to go back to their villages during the first phase of the lockdown. And they had no other. I mean, it was very hard to get around, and there was food scarcity in some places. So people took to entering the forests and hunting more. The other factor was that vigilance and monitoring by the forest department was very less because they were pulled into COVID duty. So it was much easier for people to hunt and engage in wildlife trade as well. So both of these factors contributed to that spike.
During your tenure as a postdoctoral researcher at ATREE, You
Mhm.
studied how land use change and habitat degradation impacted mammalian communities in the Eastern Ghats. What were the
Right.
driving factors of land use change and habitat degradation in this region?
Uh, so a lot of the northern Eastern Ghats has already been degraded many decades back, and this was because of generations of shifting cultivation, which is still happening in parts of the northern Eastern Ghats. So the region is predominantly inhabited by various indigenous tribal communities. So been there for many centuries and many generations, thousands of years, in fact. And there's still a lot of forest that they've preserved, but there's also been considerable amount of shifting cultivation. So this and the landscape is more conducive to different forms of shifting cultivation than the Western Ghats. Western Ghats is very steep, and the terrain is not at all conducive for cultivation there. Whereas the Eastern Ghats is the feature of the hills is not so steep. It's more rolling, and um, a lot more of the northern Eastern Ghats can be cultivated. So because of this, the communities that have been living there, uh, so they've done shifting cultivation for several generations, and because of this, significant portion of it was degraded earlier, was converted from forest. I won't say degraded; it was converted from forest to cultivation land earlier, and that has continued that's still continuing now to some extent. And in addition to this, there's also been mining. There's a lot of mining in Odisha and Chhattisgarh, and in some parts of Andhra as well, which has caused quite a bit of deforestation there. There's also several dams. Lots of many dams have been built over the decades, and these dams also, and they're still continuing to be built. In fact, just during my PhD from 2014, when I was doing my fieldwork, between 2014 and 2018 or 2019, five dams were built. Five minor dams were built. And this caused the deforestation of about 500 hectares, around 5 square kilometers, so about almost 1,500 acres of forest land. So this is still happening. So it's a combination of these. It's a combination of shifting cultivation over decades, over many centuries, in fact, combined with mining that's degrading a lot of the landscape in recent decades, and dam building, and plantations by the forest department, and development infrastructure. There's roads that are coming up. So it's a combination of different factors actually. But I would say in the recent decades, it's mining and dam building that have been causing more conversion of forest to non-forest land.
So, what were the findings from your study? How were the mammalian communities affected by such drastic land use change and degradation?
Yeah, so this was a major part of my PhD work. So I tried to see how is the mammal community distributed across the landscape in both intact forest and different kinds of habitats, as well as forests that were getting degraded, or forests that were getting isolated by either cultivation or some other cause. So what I found is that some species are more affected by land use change than others, in the sense that some species require a much more intact forest and undisturbed tracts of forest than other species. So, for example, species like tiger or gaur, sambar, mouse deer, these four species in particular require very undisturbed and large tracts of forest. So they cannot live in the periphery of a forest as well. They require large tracts of forest to survive, because we only found them deep inside. We did not find them anywhere close to the periphery of wherever the habitat degradation or landscape change from forest to agriculture. Whereas some other species were not so affected by habitat conversion. They lived even close to villages, or sometimes you would see them on the periphery of the villages or around the forest as well. For example, species like wild boar, these are plenty everywhere. Jackals are also plenty closer to villages and outside the forest. Barking deer. Barking deer was in fact the most abundant mammal that we found, even more than wild boars. Also four-horned antelopes, and in some cases leopards as well. So all of these species we found, could these are more generalists. So So you can find them. So they do not require such large intact tracts of forest. Whereas species like gaur, sambar, uh, mouse deer, tiger. So all of these we found only deep inside. Um, there were a few others also. Some small cats, species like the jungle cat and the rusty spotted cat, we found them closer to villages also in the forest. But leopard cat again, we found them only deep inside. So yeah, this was interesting to see the kind of tolerance that they have for different kinds of habitat.
How can the mammals of Eastern Ghats be better conserved?
I feel that a lot more of the landscape can be better managed, and by simply by restricting mining activity and dam building, lot more of the habitat can be preserved as well. For example, the Polavaram Dam, which has come up recently on the Godavari River, this is going to submerge a lot of forest land and very prime habitat as well. Prime habitat for a very, very rich community of mammal species. This is going to be submerged by the Polavaram Dam. So, if you may not know, the Polavaram Dam is a major hydropower and irrigation dam that's coming up on the Godavari River, just outside the Papikonda National Park, which is the most important protected area in the northern Eastern Ghats of Andhra. And since it's the Godavari River, which is the second biggest river in India, you can imagine the size of the dam and the size of the reservoir and the extent of forest that is going to submerge. It's going to be very, very, very big. Um, Probably this dam will affect the habitat much more than all of the shifting cultivation that has been done in the decades prior to it. And a few other dams are also being planned as well. So just by making sure that the landscape is not greatly affected by dams, I think a lot of it can be better protected as well. And also, the few protected areas can be expanded because there's only one large one in northern Andhra, the Papikonda National Park, and there's a smaller one. It's called Kambalakonda, and a lot of the forest is outside the protected area network, and not many people inhabit the landscape there as well. So if this large chunk of forest can be managed as a protected area, then at least the laws can be in place and the habitat can be better managed, and this can lead to better protection quality for the wildlife there. And another thing I feel is very important is uh, you know um, education on hunting and wildlife trade, um, because this is a major threat for wildlife in the northern Eastern Ghats, and you'll see it's very common to see hunting. You just go on the road and you'll see people carrying bows and arrows. Now, you may also see people carrying animals as well. Um, so, uh, engaging with the local communities there about, how hunting is badly impacting wildlife. They know that it's impacting wildlife, but they think there's a lot of wildlife left, so why bother? So, and also telling them about the risks involved, not just for the wildlife, but also for them. From what if there's something like COVID that comes again? So this, I think, will help a lot in helping to bounce back the mammal population there.
So you also published a couple of studies about how the pandemic highlighted the roles of humans as both threats and custodians of the environment. Could you elaborate on this a bit?
Yeah, so this was a study that was published with a lot of other authors actually, and I was not the main lead author on this. There were many colleagues involved, and this was a global level assessment. But broadly, the study found that a lot of species bounced back from during particularly the first phase of the COVID lockdown in 2020. During this phase, we estimated that at one point of time, more than 4 billion people were under lockdown globally. So this certainly did help bring back wildlife to areas that they were not sighted in for many decades. Like for example, snow leopards were being seen in some parts of Central Asia and in China. Some sea life. Um, some marine turtles were being seen in areas where they had not been seen for several decades. So this did help to bring back wildlife, but that was only because several areas were left completely undisturbed for several months. Um, so definitely this had a beneficial effect, but we also found that the lockdown also caused a spike in hunting and wildlife trade everywhere, not just India. This is across the world. So there was a considerable spike in the number of species that were being hunted, the volumes of species that were entering wildlife trade market. So this trend has been seen everywhere. And also during this period, there was a lot of the staff that are involved in wildlife management, protected area management, they were shifted to other duties. So this led to a lot more of hunting and wildlife trade, illegal trade there, and also cases of poaching and things like that. So the effects were mixed, but certainly this led to the first period of the lockdown. It led to a beneficial impact for wildlife overall. It also led to a drop in air pollution levels, sea pollution, traffic. The skies cleared up, so there were definitely I would say more positive impacts for wildlife globally than negative ones. Yeah.
That was the final question I had for you for this interview. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Anish, and good luck to you. All the best.